Hello and welcome to my video where I will teach you how to make a paper rose from the pages of a book. This is a quick and easy project and great for home decoration and also things like weddings. The materials and tools you'll need are as follows. You'll need some wire for the stem of the rose. I'm using 1.6mm aluminium wire or armature wire. Using aluminium wire is a good idea because you can shape it with your hands. You'll also need some wire cutters to cut the wire and also some pliers or something to make a small loop in the end of the wire. You'll also need PVA glue. In this case I'm using Aleene's tacky glue, and a pencil or pen, some scissors, and of course the book pages. And then all you need to do is take one book page, try and pick a book page that has text all over the front and the back, and then cut off the white border. Set that border to one side. Then you need to fold that block of text in half and cut it in half. After I had removed the border, my block of text measured about 7 inches by just over 4 inches. I'm just saying this for reference so that you know what kind of size I'm using to get the size of rose that I end up with. So as a result of using this size of book page, I ended up with a rose that had a diameter of around 2 3/4 inches. Obviously, the larger the book page you use, the larger the rose will be, and the smaller the book page, the smaller the rose will be. And then fold each of those shapes of paper diagonally. You then cut off the excess paper like I'm showing here to make a perfect square. You then make a fold in the centre of the folded edge so that the two opposing corners come together, and then you make sure that fold is crisp. And then you do exactly the same again, folding down the centre of the longest side. Now what you need to do is take your scissors and making sure that the open side is at the top so that the folded sides are towards the bottom left and bottom right. Cut a curve across the top. I'm just adding a pen line here to illustrate where I will be cutting, but you shouldn't add any marks onto the paper because these will be visible in the final rose. You're trying to make each of the sides on the right and left the same length and have a nice curved arc at the top. If you open out the shape now, you'll see the petal-like shape you have now created. And the last step is to take a tiny little notch out of the corner of this cone shape. This will create a small hole in the centre of your circular petal shape. You'll now need to repeat these steps 2 more times, so then you end up with 3 of these shapes. So once you've got those 3 shapes, you'll then need to do some cutting. For one of the shapes, you cut out one of the folded segments. For another shape, you cut out 2 of the folded segments. And for the last shape, you cut out 3 of those segments. When you cut out these segments, make sure that you keep these pieces. Don't throw those pieces away because you'll need them later. This is where you need the glue. So you now fold each of these shapes up so that one segment overlaps the adjacent one, and glue that into place. This will make 3 cone shapes, each a bit narrower than the last. These will end up sitting inside each other. Once you've done that and left them to dry, you can use your pencil or pen or some other cylindrical narrow item and use it to curl the petals over. This makes a really nice detail. You simply wrap each of the petals slightly around the body of your pencil so that the petals curl outwards. Be gentle when doing this because it can rip the paper, and you only need to curl each of the petals a little bit to get the right effect. Now we're going to make each of the pieces that you cut out earlier, the little segments, into more cone shapes. So for the smallest of those cut out sections, you simply roll it up into a narrow cylinder and glue it in place, as shown. For the other two pieces, you can try and remove the folds slightly to make it more of a flat, smooth shape, and then just apply a little bit of glue along one side. You only need to overlap one edge over the other, very slightly this time. You don't have to overlap a whole segment, and then glue it in place and leave it so you have a nice cone shape. And you do this for both of those larger pieces. So then you'll end up with 6 pieces that will fit inside one another. And then all you need to do is cut a very small hole in the point of each of the larger cones. Now it's time to move on to the wire stem. For a rose that's the size of the one I'm doing, I recommend a stem of about 11 to 12 inches. It's just a matter of estimating and seeing what would look best in proportion with the size of the rose you're making. And then just cut that length from your reel of wire. Remember that you can always cut a wire stem down to size, but you can't add more wire, so overestimate the amount you will need. Next you will need to make a small loop in one end of the wire. I'm using my round nose pliers to do this. You basically make a very small lollipop shape. You then push this loop into the spiral of paper you have made, which is the narrowest piece of the rose. It should just about fit. If it doesn't fit, try and make your loop smaller so that it does. Add some glue and push that loop back into the spiral so that it just sits at one end. And then leave it to dry. And then you simply feed the rest of the pieces onto your wire. I then like to add a little bit of glue on the wire underneath to hold the paper pieces in place and leave it to dry. Then the next step is to wrap the wire stem. Now there are many options of how to cover the wire stem, and I'm just going to use the book pages. However, you could use all sorts of paper, including sheet music, crepe paper, tissue paper, whatever you like really, as long as it's thin enough for the glue to absorb into. If you want a particularly quick method, then floral tape, which comes in a range of colours, particularly green and brown, can quickly be wrapped around the wire stem, and that is really effective. How I'm going to do it is first cut the book pages into strips. To do this, I'll remove the plain borders once again, and then cut the page vertically into thin strips. The thinner the strips are, the easier they will be to wrap around. Then I simply add my PVA glue to the wire stem and start wrapping the strips around. As I go along, I also add the glue on top of the paper strips to fix them in place and also give it a protective coating. The other way you can do it is by doing paper mache. This is a bit easier in fact, but it just gets a little bit messy, which is why I'm not doing it. However, to do this you would simply mix PVA with water, No more than 1 part water to 2 parts PVA, so only dilute the PVA a little bit. Then simply put this mixture into a plastic container. Dip 1 paper strip into this mixture and remove the excess with your fingers. And then wrap the paper strip around the wire. The paper can be a bit more vulnerable to ripping in the paper mache technique, but it is a bit easier to wrap the paper around the stem whilst it is wet. So it's completely up to you how you do this step, and you can even paint the paper stem afterwards if you like. Once you've completed covering the stem, you can leave it to dry. The next step is to add the leaves. To do this, I just cut out 2 simple leaf shapes. Each of my leaves were nearly 2.5 inches long, but you can make your leaves any size or shape you want. In order to make the leaves symmetrical, I cut out a rectangle from the book pages, folded it vertically in half, and then cut out the shape. I then used my scissors to add a serrated edge around the outside of the leaf to make a kind of fringing detail, but this is completely optional. I then glued the leaves onto the stem with the glue. I pointed the leaves upwards on purpose, and this was just whilst the glue was drying, but once the glue dried, I then lowered the leaves into a more realistic position. The reason I didn't do this when the glue was wet is because it's very easy to damage the bottom of the leaves whilst the paper is soggy. So it's much better to try and manipulate the position of the leaves after the glue has dried. And the final step is to make the sepals of the rose, and these are the leaves that are just below the petals. Again, this is an optional step, but I think it adds a very nice detail. To do this, I cut out 4 of these sort of rounded triangle shapes, which in my case were about 1 inch long. I curved each of the sepals over my pencil to make them curl outwards. I then glued 2 of these sepals onto the underside of the petals, 1 on either side of the rose, and I also added glue onto the top of the paper to secure it. I then added the 2 remaining sepals in the same way, 1 on either side, to fill in the gaps. I added enough glue to secure them all in place and left them to dry. And that is my paper rose finished. I hope you've enjoyed making your flowers, and thanks very much for watching.